Explorations of the Nile Source, Sir Samuel Baker. The Albert Nyanza. Sir Samuel Whitebaker was born in London on June 8, 1821. From early manhood he devoted himself to a life of adventure. After a year in Mauritius he founded a colony in the mountains of Ceylon at Nuera Eliya, and later constructed the railway across the Dobrudscha. His discovery of the Albert Nyanza completed the labours of Speke and Grant, and solved the mystery of the Nile. Baker's administration of the Sudan was the first great effort to arrest the slave trade in the Nile basin, and also the first step towards the establishment of the British Protectorate of Uganda and Somaliland. Baker died on December 30th, 1893. He was a voluminous writer, and his books had immense popularity. The Albert Nyanza may be regarded as the most important of his works of travel by reason of the exploration which it records, rather than on account of any exceptional literary merit. Here, his story is one of such thrilling interest that even a dull writer could scarce have failed to hold the attention of any reader by its straightforward narration. In March 1861, I commenced an expedition to discover the sources of the Nile, with the hope of meeting the East African expedition of Captains Speke and Grant that had been sent by the English government from the south via Zanzibar for that object. From my youth I had been inured to hardships and endurance in wild sports in tropical climates, and when I gazed upon the map of Africa, I had the hope that I might, by perseverance, reach the heart of Africa. Had I been alone, it would have been no hard lot to die upon the untrodden path before me. But my wife resolved, with woman's constancy, to leave the luxuries of home and share all danger, and to follow me through each rough step in the wild life in which I was about to engage. Thus accompanied, on April 15, 1861, I sailed up the Nile from Cairo to Korosko, and thence, by a forced camel march across the Nubian desert, we reached the river of Abu Hamed, and still on camels, though within view of the palm trees that bordered the Nile, we came to Berber. I spent a year in learning Arabic, and while doing so explored the Atbara, which joins the Nile 20 miles south of Berber, and the Blue Nile, which joins the main stream at Khartoum, with all their affluents from the mountains of Abyssinia. The general result of these explorations was that I found that the waters of the Atbara, when in flood, are dense with soil, washed from the fertile lands scoured by its tributaries after the melting of the snows and the rainy season. And these, joining with the Blue Nile in full flood, also charged with a red earthy matter, cause the annual inundation in Lower Egypt, the sediment from which gives to that country its remarkable fertility. I reached Khartoum, the capital of the Sudan, on June 11, 1862. Musa Pasha was at that time Governor-General. He was a rather exaggerated specimen of Turkish authority, combining the worst of Oriental failings with the brutality of the wild animal. At that time the Sudan was of little commercial importance to Egypt. What prompted the occupation of the country by the Egyptians was that the Sudan supplied slaves not only for Egypt but for Arabia and Persia. In the face of determined opposition of Musa Pasha and the Nile traders, who were persuaded that my object in penetrating into unknown Central Africa was to put a stop to the nefarious slave traffic, I organized my expedition. It consisted of 3 vessels, a good-decked dahabaya for my wife and myself and our personal attendants, and 2 noggers, or sailing barges, the latter to take stores, 21 donkeys, 4 camels, and 4 horses. 45 armed men as escort, and 40 sailors, all in brown uniform, with servants, 96 men in all, constituted my personnel. On February 2, 1863, we reached Gondokoro, where I landed my animals and stores. It is a curious circumstance that although many Europeans had been as far south as Gondokoro, I was the first Englishman who had ever reached it. Gondokoro, I found a perfect hell. There were about 600 slave hunters and ivory traders and their people who passed the whole of their time in drinking, quarrelling, and ill-treating the slaves of which the camps were full, and the natives assured me that there were large depots of slaves in the interior who would be marched to Gondokoro for shipment to the Sudan a few hours after my departure. I had heard rumours of Speke and Grant, and determined to wait for a time before proceeding forward. Before very long there was a mutiny among my men, who wanted to make a razzia upon the cattle of the natives, which of course I prohibited. It had been instigated by the traders, who were determined, if possible, to stop my advance. With the heroic assistance of my wife, I quelled the revolt. On February 15th, on the rattle of musketry at a great distance, my men rushed madly to my boat with the report that 2 white men who had come from the sea had arrived. Could they be Speke and Grant? Off I ran and soon met them in reality, and with a heart beating with joy I took off my cap and gave a welcome hurrah. We were shortly seated on the deck of my debia under the awning, and such rough fare as could be hastily prepared was set before these 2 ragged, careworn specimens of African travel. At the first blush of meeting them, I considered my expedition as terminated, since they had discovered the Nile source. But upon my congratulating them with all my heart upon the honours they had so nobly earned, Speke and Grant, with characteristic generosity, gave me a map of their route, showing that they had been unable to complete the actual exploration of the Nile, and that the most important portions still remained to be determined. It appeared that in N-lat 2 degrees 17' they had crossed the Nile, which they had tracked from the Victoria Lake. But the river, which from its exit from that lake had a northern course, turned suddenly to the west from Karuma Falls, the point at which they crossed it at lat 2 degrees 17'. They did not see the Nile again until they arrived in N-lat 3 degrees 32', which was then flowing from the WSW. The natives and the king of Unyoro, Kamrasi, had assured them that the Nile from the Victoria Nyanza, which they had crossed at Karuma, flowed westward for several days' journey, and at length fell into a large lake called the Luta Nziga, that this lake came from the south, and that the Nile, on entering the northern extremity, almost immediately made its exit, and, as a navigable river, continued its course to the north, through the Koshi and Madi countries. Both Speke and Grant attached great importance to this lake Luta Nziga, and the former was much annoyed that it had been impossible for them to carry out the exploration. I now heard that the field was not only open, but that an additional interest was given to the exploration by the proof that the Nile flowed out of one great lake, the Victoria, but that it evidently must derive an additional supply from an unknown lake, as it entered it at the northern extremity, while the body of the lake came from the south. The fact of a great body of water, such as the Luta Nziga, extending in a direct line from south to north, while the general system of drainage of the Nile was from the same direction, showed most conclusively that the Luta Nziga, if it existed in the form assumed, must have an important position in the basin of the Nile. I determined, therefore, to go on. Speke and Grant, who were naturally anxious to reach England as soon as possible, sailed in my boat on February 26th from Gondokoro for Khartoum. Our hearts were much too full to say more than a short "God bless you." They had won their victory. My work lay all before me. 2. Perils of Darkest Africa. My plan was to follow a party of traders known by the name of Turks, and led by an Arab named Ibrahim, which was going to the Latuka country to trade for ivory and slaves, trusting to providence, good fortune, and the virtue of presents. That party set out early in the afternoon of March 26, 1863. I had secured some rather unwilling men as drivers and porters, and was accompanied by 2 trusty followers, Richan and a boy Sat, both of whom had been brought up in the Austrian mission in Khartoum. We had neither guide nor interpreter, but when the moon rose, knowing that the route lay on the east side of the mountain of Belignon, I led the way on my horse Filfil, Mrs. Baker riding by my side on my old Abyssinian hunter Tetel, and the British flag following behind us, as a guide for the caravan of heavily laden camels and donkeys. We pushed on over rough country intersected by ravines till we came to the valley of Tologo, bounded with perpendicular walls of grey granite, 1,000 feet in height, the natives of which were much excited at the sight of the horses and the camels, which were to them unknown animals. After passing through this defile, Ibrahim and his Turks, whom we had passed during the previous night, overtook us. These slave hunters and ivory traders threatened effectually to spoil our enterprise, if not to secure the murder of Mrs. Baker, myself, and my entire party, by raising the suspicion and enmity of the native tribes. We afterwards found that there had been a conspiracy to do this. We thought it best, therefore, to parley with Ibrahim, and came to terms with him by means of bribes of a double-barrelled gun and some gold. Under his auspices, our joint caravan cleared the palisaded villages of Illyria, after paying blackmail to the chief Léger, whose villainous countenance was stamped with ferocity, avarice, and sensuality. Glad to escape from this country, we crossed the Kanieti River, a tributary of the Sobat, itself a tributary of the White Nile, and entered the country of Latuka, which is bounded by the Lafitte chain of mountains. In the forests and on the plain were countless elephants, giraffes, buffaloes, rhinoceroses, and varieties of large antelopes, together with winged game. The natives are the finest savages I've ever seen, their average height being 5 feet 11.5 inches, and their facial features remarkably pleasing. We stayed on many weeks at Tarangole, the capital, which is completely surrounded by palisaded walls, within which are over 3,000 houses, each a little fort in itself, and kraals for 12,000 head of cattle. In the neighborhood, I had some splendid big game shooting, but we had difficulties with repeated mutinies of our men. Early in May, we left Latuka and crossed a high mountain chain by a pass, 2,500 feet in height, into the beautiful country of Obo. This is a fertile plateau, 3,674 feet above sea level, with abundance of wild grapes and other fruits, yams, nuts, flax, tobacco, etc. But the travelling was difficult owing to the high grass. The people are pleasant-featured and good-natured, and the chief, Kachiba, maintains his authority by a species of hocus-pocus or sorcery. He is a merry soul, has a multiplicity of wives, a bevy in each village, so that when he travels through his kingdom, he is always at home. His children number 116, and the government is quite a family affair, for he has one of his sons as chief in every village. A native of Obo showed me some cowrie shells, which he said came from a country called Magungo, situated on a lake so large that no one knew its limits. This lake, said I, can be no other than Luta Nziga, which Speak had heard of, and I shall take the first opportunity to push for Magungo. We returned to Latuka to pick up our stores and rejoin Ibrahim, but were detained by the illness of Mrs. Baker and myself, and the loss of some of my transport animals. The joint caravan left Latuka on June 23rd for Unyoro, Mrs. Baker in an improvised palanquin. The weather was wretched. Constant rains made progress slow, and the natives of the districts through which we passed were dying like flies from smallpox. When we at last reached Obo, we could proceed no further. My wife and I were so ill with bilious fever that we could not assist each other. My horses, camels and donkeys all died. Flies by day, rats and innumerable bugs by night in the miserable hut where we were located, lions roaring through the dark, never-ending rains, made for many weary months of Obo a prison about as disagreeable as could be imagined. Having purchased some oxen in lieu of horses and baggage animals, we at length were able to leave Obo on January 5th, 1864, passing through Farajoke, crossing the river Asua at an altitude of 2,875 feet above sea level, and then on to Fatiko, the capital of the Shua country, at an altitude of 3,877 feet. 3. Discovery of the Nile sources. Shua proved a land flowing with milk and honey. Provisions of every kind were abundant and cheap. The pure air invigorated Mrs. Baker and myself, and on January 18th we left Shua for Unyoro, Kamrasi's country. On the 22nd we struck the Somerset River, or the Victoria White Nile, and crossed it at the Karuma Falls, marching thence to Maruli, Kamrasi's capital, at the junction of the Kafur River with the Somerset, which was reached on February 10th. Here we were detained till February 21st, with exasperating excuses for preventing us going further, and audacious demands from Kamrasi for everything that I had, including my last watch and my wife. We were surrounded by a great number of natives, and as my suspicions of treachery appeared confirmed, I drew my revolver, resolved that if this was to be the end of the expedition, it should also be the end of Kamrasi. I held the revolver within 2 feet of his chest, looked at him with undisguised contempt, and told him that if he dared to repeat the insult, I would shoot him on the spot. My wife also made him a speech in Arabic, not a word of which he understood, with a countenance as amiable as the head of a Medusa. Altogether, the mise-en-scène utterly astonished him, and he let us go, furnishing us with a guide named Rabongo to take us to Mwutananzig, not Lutanziga, as Speak had erroneously suggested. In crossing the Kafur River on a bridge of floating weeds, Mrs. Baker had a sunstroke, fell through the weeds into deep water, and was rescued with great difficulty. For many days she remained in a deep torpor and was carried on a litter while we marched through an awful broken country. The torpor was followed by brain fever, with its attendant horrors. The rain poured in torrents, and day after day we were forced to travel for want of provisions, as in the deserted villages there were no supplies. Sometimes in the forest we procured wild honey, and rarely I was able to shoot a few guinea fowl. We reached a village one night following a day on which my wife had had violent convulsions. I laid her down on a litter within a hut, covered her with a Scotch plaid, and I fell upon my mat insensible, worn out with sorrow and fatigue. When I woke the next morning, I found my wife breathing gently, the fever gone, the eyes calm. She was saved. The gratitude of that moment I will not attempt to describe. On March 14th, the day broke beautifully clear, and having crossed a deep valley between the hills, we toiled up the opposite slope. I hurried to the summit. The glory of our prize burst suddenly upon me. There, like a sea of quicksilver, lay, far beneath, the grand expanse of water, a boundless sea horizon on the south and southwest, glittering in the noonday sun. And on the west, 50 or 60 miles distant, blue mountains rose from the bosom of the lake to a height of 7,000 feet above its level. It is impossible to describe the triumph of that moment. Here was the reward for all our labor, for the years of tenacity with which we had toiled through Africa. England had won the sources of the Nile. I was about 1,500 feet above the lake, and I looked down from the steep granite cliff upon those welcome waters, upon that vast reservoir which nourished Egypt and brought fertility where all was wilderness, upon that great source so long hidden from mankind, that source of bounty and of blessing to millions of human beings, and as one of the greatest objects in nature, I determined to honor it with a great name. As an imperishable memorial of one loved and mourned by our gracious Queen and deplored by every Englishman, I called this great lake the Albert Nyanza. The Victoria and the Albert Lakes are the two sources of the Nile. 4. Exploring the Great Lake. The zigzag path of the descent to the lake was so steep and dangerous that we were forced to leave our oxen with a guide, who was to take them to Magungo and wait for our arrival. We commenced the descent of the steep pass on foot. I led the way, grasping a stout bamboo. My wife, in extreme weakness, tottered down the pass, supporting herself on my shoulder and stopping to rest every 20 paces. After a toilsome descent of about 2 hours, weak with years of fever, but for the moment strengthened by success, we gained the level plain below the cliff. A walk of about a mile through flat sandy meadows of fine turf, interspersed with trees and bush, brought us to the water's edge. The waves were rolling upon a white pebbly beach. I rushed into the lake and, thirsty with fatigue, with a heart full of gratitude, I drank deep from the sources of the Nile. Within a quarter of a mile of the lake was a fishing village named Wachovia, in which we now established ourselves. At sunrise of the following morning, I took the compass to the borders of the lake to survey the country. It was beautifully clear, and with a powerful telescope I could distinguish 2 large waterfalls that cleft the sides of the mountains like threads of silver. My wife, who had followed me so devotedly, stood by my side, pale and exhausted, a wreck upon the shores of the great Albert Lake that we had so long striven to reach. No European foot had ever trod upon its sand, nor had the eyes of a white man ever scanned its vast expanse of water. We were the first, and this was the key to the great secret that even Julius Caesar yearned to unravel, but in vain. Having procured 2 canoes, we started on a voyage of exploration northward on the lake. Along the east coast, with cliffs 1,500 feet in height, we discovered a waterfall of 1,000 feet drop, formed by the Kaigiri River emptying itself in the lake. On shore there were many elephants, and in the lake hundreds of hippopotami and crocodiles. We made narrow escapes of shipwreck on several occasions, and on the 13th day of our voyage, the lake contracted to between 15 and 20 miles in width, but the canoe came into a perfect wilderness of aquatic vegetation. On the western shore was the kingdom of Malega and a chain of mountains 4,000 feet high, but decreasing in height towards the north. We reached the long-sought town of Magungo and entered a channel, which we were informed was the embouchure of the Somerset River from the Victoria Nyanza, the same river we had crossed at Karuma. Here we found our guide Rabonga and the riding oxen. The town and general level of the country was 500 feet above the water. A few miles to the north was a gap in the Malega Range. Due NE, the country was a dead flat, and as far as the eye could reach was an extent of bright green reeds marking the course of the Nile as it made its exit out of the lake. The natives refused most positively to take me down the Nile outlet on account of their dread of the Mahdi people on its banks. I determined, therefore, to go by canoe up the Somerset River and finally to fix the course of that stream as I had promised Speke to do. 5. Escape from savage enemies. Both my wife and I were helpless with fever, and when we made our first halt at a village, I had to be carried ashore on a litter, and my wife was so weak that she had to crawl on foot. At first, the river was 500 yards wide, but on the second day it narrowed to 250 yards. As we pulled up the stream, it narrowed to 180 yards, and rounding a corner, a magnificent sight burst suddenly upon us. On each side were beautifully wooded cliffs rising abruptly to a height of about 300 feet, and rushing through a gap which cleft the rock exactly before us. The river, contracted from a grand stream, was pent up in a narrow gorge of scarcely 50 yards in width. Roaring furiously through the rock-bound pass, it plunged in one leap of about 120 feet perpendicular into a dark abyss below. This was the greatest waterfall of the Nile, and in honor of the distinguished president of the Royal Geographical Society, I named it the Murchison Falls. Of course, we could proceed no farther by canoe, and landed at a deserted village. Our riding oxen had died, and we had to get some natives as porters. My wife was carried on a litter, and I was scarcely able to crawl. But after tremendous difficulties and dangers we reached, following the bank of the Somerset, on April 8th, the island of Patuan, within 18 miles of where we had first struck the river at Karuma. My exploration was therefore complete, but our difficulties were not at an end. We were detained for 2 months at Shuamoru, practically deserted by everyone except our 2 personal attendants, and all but starved. The real Kamrazi, for the man Baker and his party had seen on their outward journey, was only his brother Mugambi, afterwards came on the scene, took them to Kisuna, and there and at other places detained them practically prisoners during the long and cruel wars with his rivals, Fawuka and Rionga and the King of Uganda. On November 17th, Baker escaped with his wife and a small party and marched through the Shua country and the country of the Mahdi to the Asua River, only a quarter of a mile from its junction with the Nile. Then they crossed the country of the Bari and arrived at Gondokoro, whence they sailed down the Nile to Khartoum, which was reached on May 5, 1865, 2 years and 5 months after their start from that city.